Regional Goods Movement, second round of public meetings. I'm Christy Wilhite. I'm with the Houston-Galveston Area Council. I'm the project manager on this project. I'd like to thank you all for being here tonight. I know that having an expanding family, a new little one, I know it's hard to get out here, especially when you have kids at home or you got other things going on in your life. So we really do appreciate it. This is a very critical point in our study. In our first round of public meetings, we really just introduced the study, talked a little bit about what was going on, what we're going to try to do. But this is where we're really trying to get public feedback on on community impacts, and because that our next phase will be to address those impacts with some solutions. And so we really need to hear from the general public as well as those involved in the industry to help us understand better how freight works in your community and some of the things that you see going on that, hey, maybe there's an easy solution for it. And if you have a solution, we're interested in hearing that as well. I want to thank, especially tonight, Cambridge Systematics, who is our consultant on this project. They've also brought Halbrook and Danabaum, as well as Knudsen, who's been handling our public meeting outreach and everything like that. So you've probably seen our flyers, our ads, and that's all thanks to Patty and her group. I'd like to thank them. I'd like to recognize a few folks. If you'll just stand up and wave your hand. Richard Zintek, representing County Judge Ed Emmons' office. Thank you, Richard, for coming. We have Mayor Gary Rowley of the City of Seabrook. Thank you, Mayor, so much for being here. And Commissioner Jack Mormon is sitting on our panel, along with Rose Hernandez from his office. We thank y'all for being here and participating tonight. I'll let Paul introduce the panelists, but I want to do a few housekeeping items. Just as you saw, we've got some fresh coffee here, but I tell you, it's going to be exciting. You won't need the caffeine. And so, anyway, but the women's room is on your right as you go out the left. The men's room is on the left. And in your seat, you should have a little card and a pen. And if you don't, it's because we wanted you to sit closer up. So, sit closer up, and we have a piece of paper and a pen where you can write. As you hear the panelists talk, you may have some questions. So as you think of those questions, please write them down. We want to hear what your question is. And then if you'll just kind of shake it a little bit or raise it up, someone will come and grab that from you. And then at the end of the presentation, the discussion from our panelists, will address those questions. And so anyway, H-GAC, I don't know if you're familiar with it. We're the Council of Governments for the 13 county region. And the Metropolitan Planning Organization, which handles transportation funding for the 8 counties, so Harris and the surrounding counties. And there's a lot of great programs. You'll hear WorkSource and various programs, but one of the great programs I'd like to introduce you to is our drayage loan program, because it fits just perfectly here. Patricia Lawhorn is here to tell you a little bit about that.
Thank you, Kristen. Hi, my name is Patricia Lawhorn, and I work on a recovery grant program that H-GAC has received through the EPA and the recovery grant. What we have is $9 million to expend as quickly and responsibly as possible. And what we're doing is making low interest loans to truck drivers, truck companies, and people in that business. And I'd like to announce it to everyone and invite you to please contact me if you are interested or if you think you can help with spreading the word about the program. We've spent about $1.5 million already, and we do want to spend the rest of this money as quickly and responsibly as possible. And if you think it can benefit you or any of your friends, I do have my business card here, and it will have the website on where you can find out more about the program, or I can just tell you a little bit more. What we're doing is we're replacing older drayage vehicles going in and out of ports in the region, Port of Houston, Port of Galveston, Port Freeport, anything doing drayage activities. We're replacing the older ones, and we require them to be scrapped. And we require that you purchase a newer, more fuel-efficient vehicle, 2008 engine standard or better. And this is to help create and retain jobs, because we know the trucking industry was hit pretty hard with the economic downturn. And at the same time, we are cleaning the air, reducing NOx emissions. So if you'd like to know a little bit more, please feel free to come and speak to me. I'll be in the corner over in this end. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. And now I'd like to call Paula Dow with Cambridge Systematic. She's going to tell you a little bit about where we are in our study and a little bit more about the facts and figures we gathered.
Thank you very much. And again, I want to just pile on Christie's thank you for taking time out to come out. We do think that this is an important opportunity to really start a conversation and a dialogue between your private sector community and the public concerns, because I think that there's a lot of common ground if we could just start talking to each other about it. So what I wanted to do is really just go over a goods movement overview. We will then have a panel discussion on the needs as well as the community impacts, and then we'll also have we'll save some time at the end for some audience Q&A. And again, that's what the little slips of papers are for. So the goods movement overview. First of all, how much freight is moving in the region? Well, we are basing this off from a product by IHS Global Insight called Trend Search Data. It's important to note that these figures exclude pipeline volumes. Pipeline volumes, if you were to add it to this, add another almost nearly 450 million tons of freight moving into and out of the region. So if you look at this, you're already moving close to 700 million tons of freight, and that's projected to grow to about 1.2 billion tons. Plus, add your pipeline on top of that. So that's a significant amount of freight moving in the region. So how is the freight moving? This really breaks it down based on the different modes that we're looking at here. And you'll see that trucks represent, the tonnage that is moving via truck represents over 60% of the freight. And then you'll see rail at 20% and water at about 19%. You'll see air at less than 1%. While it's not a lot of tonnage, it's very critical tonnage in that it's typically very high value and very time sensitive. So what this tells us is that you really do need a multimodal system. It takes all modes working together to move the cargo that's moving through the region. But it is a truck dominant market, like most of the markets throughout the U.S. So what kind of freight is moving? This is important because this helps us to understand why it's using particular modes, but I think also if you take a look at the type of goods that are moving in the region, you'll see how closely tied it is to the economic activity in the region. So you take a look at this petroleum and coal products, chemical products, that's your petrochemical industry, which is your #1 industry here. And so it really is closely tied to the economic vitality and competitiveness of the region. These are goods that are moving because the employers in the region need these goods to make the things that they make, and then they need to be able to ship their final product out to markets. Very critical. You'll see secondary traffic down here. That's really representative of a lot of the wholesale and retail trade and distribution activity that's taken place. And what you see looking out into projections is that you continue to have it driven, the absolute value of freight being dominated by the petrochemical, but when you look at what categories are growing, that secondary traffic or that consumer-driven freight demand, because that's carrying the products you and I want on the store shelves, that's one of the fastest growing components. So, what are the trucks transporting? Since we said that this was a truck-dominated market, well, you'll see again, it pretty much mirrors what your primary commodities were. So, your petroleum and coal products, as well as your secondary and warehousing and distribution products, are your top commodities. If you go down through there, you'll see that all of these products are really linked to your economic growth. So, it's either going to support your key industries or it's going to support your consumer demand and your population growth. So why is freight important? Well, freight is important because it does support all the businesses within the region. Even your medical centers, even your service industries that you don't think of as being freight intensive require a lot of goods in and out of those facilities. So all your businesses depend upon being able to get certain goods and supplies. But it's also very important because it, again, transports the goods for consumers as well. As an industry itself, freight transportation is a significant economic driver throughout the region. And you'll see here just the listing of the number of jobs associated within the industry. And with the freight volumes, as those are projected to grow, the economic activity associated with them are also expected to grow. So how many more trucks are going to be up on the highways? Based upon the data that we've been analyzing, For every 100 trucks out there on the region's highways today, in 2030, you can expect there to be 177 trucks. And the map here is just saying, this is the darker the color gets, so that red, that's where you're going to have the greatest volume growth of trucks. So those are the facilities. Given the facility that you have built today, that's where you're going to see the growth, the fastest growth. So if we're taking a look at that, and if that's not the facilities we want them to use, then we need to think about what can we do to make sure that we can accommodate this growth in a way that we really want it to happen. So where is the growth going to occur? And I think that, again, very interesting, if you look at the absolute volume of freight, Harris County is going to continue to be the most heavily impacted by freight movement. In fact, they account for over 70% of all the freight tonnage moving in the region already. They'll continue to dominate, but one of the interesting things is that when you look at growth rates, you start to see that Montgomery and Missouri County are going to be the fastest growing in terms of the tonnage. And so what's going to be happening is that you're going to see a greater dispersion of the freight activity, where it's been concentrated in Harris County, and particularly to the eastern side of the region, in the port regions. You're going to see that activity to start to disperse to be close to where the population is growing, because that's going to be that secondary traffic. And so how do we make sure that we can accommodate both the business needs and then help to mitigate some of that community impact that traffic potentially could cause? And that's why we're here tonight, is to start that dialogue so that we can be proactive. We can react to some of the issues that we already have on the ground and see what we can do about it, but we can be proactive about going forward as well. So with this, we're going to have this panel discussion, and this is where we've been very fortunate in having folks agree to join the panel discussion. And we have a mixture of both public sector representation as well as private sector. And so with the public sector, these are people who are out dealing with they're in office to help deal with your issues, to make sure that your concerns are taken care of. And from the private sector perspective, I think the important thing to note is not only do they do business in the region, but they live in the region too. So they're going to have concerns from the business perspective, but they're going to have the same community concerns that all your residents are going to have. So I'd like to introduce Commissioner Jack Mormon from Harris County. We have Nancy Edmondson representing the Gulf Coast Rail District. She's a board member there. And Brian Fielkow from Jetco Delivery, private sector, and Chris Kall from Trimac. And I'll also introduce Joe Bryan with Halcro. Halcro's a member of our team, and Joe and his staff have been leading our private sector outreach. So he's going to facilitate the discussion, and he'll ask the panelists to share a little more information about it.
Thank you, Paula. You notice that there's an echo in here. It's a natural phenomenon for important subjects. The hall just sort of responds on its own. So Paul has introduced the panel. I'm going to ask them each to say a little bit about who they are and what they're doing. I want to underscore something that Paul said to you. The people sitting here could just as well be sitting in the audience. In other words, they came from the community just like you did. So this is a discussion about things that all of you are doing together. It's a community set of issues. So with that, I'll turn it over to the commissioners. You start, we'll go right across the table, so Chris, you'll be doing cleanup.
Well, good evening. My name is Jack Mormon. I'm Harris County Commissioner for right here in Precinct 2 for the last 3.5 months. So what he said was especially true. 3.5 months ago, I was sitting right there. I live in Deer Park, so this is, can you not hear me? I can speak up, that's okay, that's not a problem.
Yeah.
Joe. I call Joe the Reverend, so I think he can speak up louder and we'll get this.
And this is my backyard. I live in Deer Park. I have pretty much my whole life. So what we're talking about here today is really near and dear to my heart, because we've got the petrochem industry in Precinct 2. We've got the Port of Houston in Precinct 2. So talking about how the best way to move goods around our community to mitigate the impact on you and I, our daily lives, and to find the best way to get the goods in and out of the port or the petrochem complex really is one of the things that is at the top of our priority. We're getting back to focusing on infrastructure, so that's got really a lot to do with what we're here to talk about today.
My name's Nancy Edmondson. I'm a board member on the Gulf Coast Rail District and a lifelong resident of East Harris County. So I live and breathe the same issues that we're talking about today. I thought I'd use my couple of minutes to tell y'all what in the world the Gulf Coast Rail District is, because I know many of you, it's not something you're very familiar with. It was created by the legislature in 2007. I've served on the board since it was established. It started out as a Harris County, Fort Bend County district, and was since expanded and added Galveston County, Waller County, and Montgomery County. So it's a five county district that's been charged with helping to facilitate improvements in the freight rail and commuter rail networks in the region. Unfortunately, we were charged with making things better without any sort of taxing authority or other monies to do that. So in some ways right now, we're a bully pulpit to bring the issues that this study that H-GAC is doing to the forefront. In some ways, the rail network, because it's privately owned, has never been something that's had a lot of public sector focus, even though how well that rail network operates is something that affects the public very much. So we're a district with great expectations and very few resources right now, but it's been interesting. We have gotten some things accomplished. Just as a side here, one of the challenges we have, and I guess we'll talk about challenges later, is this issue of kind of the balancing of the public and private sector needs. So I guess I'm on the public sector portion of this panel, but we work very closely with the railroads to try to bring the public sector perspective to the issues that the railroad's facing. How is what they're doing affecting both the economic vitality of the region as well as affecting the residents that live around the freight networks. So my perspective today will very much come from the railroad side of things and how that complements and can improve the highway side.
Thank you. My name is Brian Fielkow. I'm the president of Jetco Delivery. We run about 100 trucks throughout Houston and the Gulf Coast. This is our home. We live here, our employees live here, and we have a very personal interest in this topic. In addition, I'm the chairman of the TMTA Intermodal Committee. The TMTA is the Texas Motor Transportation Association. So I get to kind of step away from our company's maybe specific interest and look at issues affecting our overall industry. I guess from my standpoint, the issues I raise really I think are more as a resident of the area to start with, and that's safety, and that's ensuring that there's alignment between the public and private sector on running our business as safe as possible. And I think that the trucking industry has made tremendous strides toward improving safety, but nowhere near where we ultimately need to be or want to be. And there needs to be more dialogue on that, and more understanding of what we can do. I love these new signs. You can't miss them. The electronic signs, about texting and driving and what a bad idea that is. And those types of dialogues are something I think need to happen between the professional CDL drivers and the community. Some of the more specific issues that I think we have just operationally, especially in this part of the city, obviously there are bottlenecks, truck bottlenecks getting in and out of the port, and everybody is affected by that. Import containers can be a real challenge because you don't know if they're coming in locked and braced the way that to the standards that our exporters, people here, are doing. So that's always a safety concern and kind of an operational concern. Another thing I'd point out that I think has a significant community impact, and I'm so glad the H-GAC is doing something about it, is just the environmental impact. And I think there's ways to address the environmental impact, and I hope we can get into that later, but just generally, focus on truck idling when trucks don't need to be running, they shouldn't run. The truck technology to minimize the impact on the environment is here now. It's not something that we're thinking about maybe in 10 years. It's here now, but the stark reality is that a new truck with today's technology can cost $115,000, $125,000. And you're competing with trucks on the road that are maybe 15 years older that cost $10,000. And that creates a real issue. But make no mistake about it, the technology is here for trucks to run cleaner. And finally, just playing off of a little bit of what Nancy said, is that a lot of times you hear a conversation, it's the trucking industry versus the rail industry, or the trucking industry versus that industry. And our wish would be for the conversation to continue to be constructive and continue to be proactive and realize that we need each other, and let's figure out how to handle freight that's in the best interest of the residents of the community.
Thank you. My name is Christopher Kall. I'm the branch manager for Trimac Transportation. Very local. As a matter of fact, just down the street here off of Fairmont Parkway. I live locally as well, live in League City. As a branch manager, I run an operation for Trimac, who's a provider of bulk trucking services in North America, as well as related logistics, tank maintenance and cleaning services. We provide highway transportation of dry, gaseous, and liquid commodities to industrial customers throughout North America through a branch network of 120 terminals. My local facility here, I have over 70 drivers and a staff of mechanics and tank wash technicians that, again, all live in the same area and have the same concerns. I probably see it more from a driver's point of view, because I actually deal with them on a daily basis, so I see a lot of the issues that they have. And we're constantly striving to work in harmony with the community, because we're all members of the community as well. We have issues with DOT regulations that are trying to limit the number of hours a driver can drive, and it's very, very black and white. It's not gray, and it's not necessarily the right thing to do. We looked at the infrastructure, the highway, the conditions, the same issues that we're dealing with as individuals on the roads. The drivers that work for me have the same problems. We're trying to abide by the idling laws that are coming through, but what you'll see is there's congestion in the rest areas. There's not enough rest areas on the road, and they're still trying to work within these guidelines for these hours of service that are making things quite difficult and not necessarily making things safer. We're concerned about education, driver education, and where that's being handled with new drivers coming out on the road, making sure that people understand what the driver's concerned about when they're on the freeways and how they can see you and whether you see them, and what it takes to make an 80,000-pound vehicle stop or more. We'd like to see ways of getting more trucks off the road, looking at increasing capacity, put more weight on trucks so that you can have trucks removed from the system and can carry more freight by a single individual. So I think there's a lot of things that, again, working together that we can make a positive improvement in the condition of the roads, the congestion that we all deal with, and try to make the whole system work better.
Good, thank you. So, we are going to ask the set of panelists 4 questions. And the panelists will each respond. They've had these questions ahead of time, so they will they're ready for it. Each one of them will say a few things on each one of the questions, and then as we get to after each has spoken, then we'll allow a little bit of interaction with each other. We have a diversity of views here, and that's part of the purpose. And some of what you may have begun to feel is that there are trade-offs in all kinds of things. What things make for productivity versus what things make for safety. You try to have them both be the same thing, but we'll get to this sort of question. So the first question for the panel then, and Chris, I'm going to have you start. We'll go from your end over this way, just so you have to handle the microphone. The first question is, what are the most important roadways or freight facilities in your operating district or in your jurisdiction? And a facility in this case could be something like a terminal. It could be a port. It could be a piece of road or a set of roads.
Well, for us, and where I'm particularly located right here, we deal with the Houston-Galveston petrochemical complex. So it's all the chemical companies in this area, including the ports for rail and sea that we're in and out of. And with that is the corresponding road network, whether it's 146, 225, and then the major freeways 45, 59, Beltway 8, 9, 10. Because the freight that we haul originates here, and a majority of it doesn't terminate here. We're going over the road, we're going up into the northeast and midwest and out to the west coast. So we're over all the roads there.
How do you get, you said your terminal though is down the road. How do you get in, what road do you use to get in and out of that and to access the broader world?
And we do carry hazardous materials, and one of the things that you'll see, because we do access all of these points through Fairmont Parkway here. For us, being located there, we are obviously an origin and a destination point, so we do bring hazardous materials in and out of that location. It's an industrial complex right off of Bay Park Road, next to major chemical plants. So we are traveling down Fairmont Parkway. We dealt with the congestion right there on Fairmont 146. We try to alter our schedule to try to get through there at earlier points in the day or later at night. But again, we deal with certain restrictions on loading times and delivery times.
Yeah, for us, Bayport and Barber's Cut are significant, huge importance to us, as well as all the city terminals, industrial terminals, Manchester, city docks, all the break bulk terminals. So, we really rely heavily on the roads leading in and out of those facilities. So for us, 146, 225, 610, a lot of traffic either going into the city or out to the airport via 59 or 45. We really travel the whole city, but the most important roads, the ones that we travel the most, are the ones right here.
We're all very familiar with the highways and the roadways and the network that the freight operators use, obviously, because we drive on them ourselves. The trains, though, the rail network's a little different, so I'm going to give you just a couple pieces of information about it. Most people's knowledge of the rail system amounts to which crossing that they get stopped at most frequently and whose trains are they cursing as they go by. But the primary rail operator in our region is Union Pacific, who's the largest operator and owns the majority of the track. Second to that is Burlington Northern Santa Fe. PTRA is the Port Terminal Railroad Association, I guess, which is kind of a short line operator that's along the north and the south side of the ship channel that's owned by the port as well as the two major rail operators. So it's a short line system that feeds into the Union Pacific system. A couple of just background statistics I thought might be useful. There's about 2,200 trains a week that travel through the Houston-Galveston area, serving over 900 customers, which is something worth mentioning about trains. One of the common questions we get is, well, why don't you just move the trains out of Houston and we won't have the problems anymore? The main problem is that 95% of the train traffic that comes in and out of our area is either origined or destined here. It isn't trains that are just passing through. There are a few operated by Kansas City Southern, but not many. Most of them are here because this is who they're serving and we need them to be here. While there's over 800 miles of mainline track in our area, if we want to focus on the most important ones, if you will, it's probably the ones that are the most heavily used, which is obviously the tracks that go in and out of the industries along the ship channel, and all of that comes together in East Houston. So, if you think about the areas of East Houston around the old turning basin, that's where a lot of the terminal operations are, or the switching operations for the railroad companies where they put together the big trains. All the train traffic has to come there. So a lot of our focus on congestion problems and other issues are related to, it all has to come together in East Houston. If that area doesn't work well, it's going to ripple into problems into this area and ripple into problems for the major carriers.
Well, sorry, I hit it on it in my introduction. The two of our real assets in Precinct 2 are the petrochem industry and the port, and obviously that's a source of job growth and economic activity for us, but it's also a source of headaches and hassles for us as commuters as well. Nancy's here talking about rail. We've got to better utilize rail, but I don't think it needs to be a battle necessarily. It's got to be more of, I mean, the two are inherently conflicting sometimes, but we've got to do better utilizing both in order to get in order for Precinct 2 not to be the choke point and get the goods out of the area and moving throughout the country wherever their destination ultimately may be. Back in the early 1900s, there were more than a dozen rail lines specifically into Harris County to service the petrochem and the ports. Most of those are still active today, and those that aren't could relatively easily be reactivated or reutilized in order to help alleviate some of the traffic. As far as the highways and byways that are especially important to me, to us in Precinct 2, obviously the main ones, I-10, I-45, those are crucial. They're U.S. Highways 59 and 290 are always sources of traffic and congestion, maybe not necessarily in Precinct 2. State Highways 146 and 225 are huge, as the other panelists mentioned, as far as getting goods in and out and trying to keep them off our surface streets. So we've got a lot of assets, a lot of infrastructure that is great that we need to utilize, but we need to better utilize it, I think.
Thank you. So, a couple things you just heard. You heard that in this district, you're sitting on two of the primary assets, economic assets of the region, the port and the petrochemical industry. They're not, and frankly, you could argue that those are national assets as well as Texas and regional assets. But they're also drivers of the economy. And they're not just directly jobs here, but they're also the fact that all of the retail business, the consumer business, all of that is affected somehow by the fact that there are jobs and activity in those two huge engines of economic growth. So, and they're here. And so then you heard the roads that get used, the straightforward ones like 45, 59, but also 146, 225, really essential roads, and also the connections from them into the very specific facilities. How do you get from 146 into the port? How do you get from 225 into a refinery? All of those things are important too, because you got to do the whole thing. Now the next question is has to do with hotspots or bottlenecks, either physical ones like a railroad grade crossing, Nancy, or some other or a difficult intersection. But they can also be institutional, which would be how the public and private sector interact, or also how different businesses interact. Like how well Brian, are you able to interact with the port and all the other players that have to work at the port in order to make all of that activity work well. So the next set of questions are about what are those things and what are the effects of the bottlenecks. What does that do to the system and do to your functions or your operation? Nancy, do you want to start this one?
I think I'll focus here on kind of the physical bottlenecks. Some of the other institutional bottlenecks, if you will, that you mentioned, I may touch on the impediments to the system, kind of where they fit to me. So physical bottlenecks, though, in some ways it's very, very easy to see on the rail network. Probably nobody ever sat around and thought about it too much, but you can't get across the ship channel on a train. You know, there's no tunnel underneath there that carries a train. There's no bridge that carries a train. So all of the activity has to go to where there are two bridges over Buffalo Bayou east of the turning basin. Both of those bridges are very old. Both of them are single track, so they've got double tracks that feed into these bridges. That's a natural bottleneck that very much needs to be alleviated. It also means, though, that all the train traffic we think about from our area, if we want to think about kind of the southeast Harris County area, it doesn't matter where it's going, it has to funnel through, pretty much has to funnel through those bridges into the yard and shops that are in East Houston before that rail activity is distributed elsewhere. So again, there's not really a way to disperse our issue, it all has to come together in a very tight area. Related to that, there's also an additional bottleneck that's on, I guess you think about, it's kind of the north end of the East Houston area. It's called Belt Junction, and it's another place where a number of rail lines come together, reduce capacity there before the trains can start to disperse up you familiar with the track that goes up the Hardy Toll Road, as well as the tracks that start to go east out of the Houston area. So the challenges of getting a lot of trains through a very densely populated historic part of Houston is one of the biggest challenges that both the railroads face, as well as the rail district, in trying to assist them with those problems.
Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
I won't talk about rush hour as a bottleneck, but
Why not?
running 80,000 pounds down the road during rush hour is obviously something that every one of our drivers, every professional driver is very concerned about. Because
Brian,
that's
Brian, elaborate on it. Why are you even out at rush hour?
Well, a lot of times you've got to move the freight. I mean, if you didn't get going until 9 o'clock and end your day at 4 o'clock, that's difficult. We try and plan around rush hour. Some loads, large permit loads, have curfews and can't run during those hours. Most loads can. So, you need to be real. I mean, the rush hour on some of these, on some of the highways, is an impediment. It's something that we actually spend a lot of time talking about and training our drivers on, because it's a whole different skill set. I mean, if somebody cuts you off, you back off and let them go. And make sure that, as professional drivers, we're using the right road etiquette regardless of anything else. I would point out 290 is probably the most significant concern in terms of a highway that always seems to be congested and is a problem. I think that's in contrast to the phenomenal job they did on parts of 10 as that's opened up. So 290 is I think a long-term concern that we have, because we see the population really growing. We see demand for passenger vehicle and truck traffic only continuing to grow in that corridor, and that's a major concern. Here, the traffic in and out of the ports has gotten much better from a trucking company standpoint since Bayport opened up. When it was just Barber's Cut, it was different. And then when the economy got bad, we kind of wished for those long lines. But I think long term, traffic in and out of the ports is a concern. There's a lot of idling, there's a lot of waiting. On a real busy day, that's still a problem. And one other issue I'd point out is, when you see a truck coming down the road and has a container or a flatbed on it, it's mounted to a chassis. And in most cases, not all, but in most cases, that chassis is usually provided by a chassis pool. There's several chassis pools that operate in this area. And we work closely with the pool operators in terms of commitment to safety. But the reality is, you don't know who used that chassis last. I could pick it up today, turn it in tomorrow, and then somebody else will pick it up tomorrow. And what did I do with that chassis? Who knows? It's not the same as owning your own trailer or owning your own truck. Or when I say owning, I mean having it under your control. And the chassis pools, when you think of the tens and thousands of chassis that they're maintaining, are they going to get every issue every day? Probably not. And the chassis pools is a real concern, because we only want to run the best possible equipment. The pool providers only want to provide the safest possible equipment, but there are days that doesn't work. There's days that it just doesn't happen, and I think that's a significant concern, just in terms of being sure that all the cargo that comes out of this area is moving safely on safe, well-maintained wheels.
Thank you. Many of the same issues. definitely the congestion side of it and dealing with the rush hour traffic. Our problem is dealing with the major chemical companies in the area. For the most part, loading and unloading is done between the hours of 8 and 5. Usually they want you there at 8 o'clock in the morning at every single location, whether you're loading or delivering. It's a breath of fresh air when we're told you've got open loading and open deliveries, 24-hour facility. When that happens, we can get better utilization of our assets. And that's what I'm employed to do. I have drivers that will work a second shift or a third shift, and that's great when we have the ability to be flexible like that. But everybody can't have everything at 8 o'clock in the morning, and we're all trying to do that. As far as bottlenecks go, 146, the area is obviously growing with the boards. I think maybe we haven't grown fast enough alongside it. There's going to be some good things coming on 146 with the overpasses being put in, but as it stands right now, it's definitely a bottleneck. And when that happens, it keeps people out on the road longer than they need to be. It causes congestion, it causes frustration. Everybody's heard of drivers that, with road rage, it's the talk of what's going on right now, distracted driving. It's because you're sitting in traffic and you're just there way too long and you're not taking care of business, so it affects all of us. We would love to see that open up. 45 southbound gets really bad. The Beltway opening up has been fantastic. Being on the east side of town using that, it just has been a great plus for us. But then there's also on the institutional side, talking about, like I mentioned earlier, the government regulations. And if we could look at changing, you could say 80,000 pounds, and that is a significant amount of weight, but there's been some major advancements in braking technology. Other states have load restrictions that are higher, upwards of 120,000 pounds. And that in itself would reduce the number of trucks that you need on the road. And I think that's a benefit to everybody, getting the emissions out, stopping the icon. I think there's some real gains that can be seen from that. CSA 2010, it's reducing our ability to be efficient. There's good things that can come out of that, but in the meantime, we're going through a lot of growing changes with the new regulations that are coming up and all happening at the same time. With the economy slowly starting to trickle on the upward side, we're seeing some things happen, and that's all starting to converge at the same time. So there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of congestion, a lot of regulation. I think it's just kind of all coming together.
Sure. As far as the physical hot spots, I would encourage the audience and our community to be vocal about it, because obviously we know about the big obvious ones, but for the local ones, the ones that you guys see every day, I would encourage your input. And that leads me nicely to introducing my Director of Road Bridge Capital Improvements, is Jack Rodriguez. He's right there. So when you want a bend an ear, he is the ear to bend. But 290 was referenced, and I know that Hectra, the toll road authority, is working with Tech Scott to try to add capacity out there, whether it be through the Hempstead Tollway, which is a planned toll road that would be an alternative to 290 to add, not add capacity on 290, but to take away some of the traffic there. So that's certainly one option. As far as a non-physical hotspot, obviously infrastructure needs, at least in Precinct 2, are near limitless, and the obvious issue is funding, at least in Precinct 2, and I know TxDOT is in the same boat, even more so than we are, but our funding is anything but limitless as far as being able to accomplish and take care of all the infrastructure needs that we actually need for the area. So we are going to have to partner and look for more partnerships, whether it be the port or one of the 15 cities we have in Precinct 2, to try to leverage each and every dollar we've got. And we've certainly got to prioritize the projects that will give us the most infrastructure bang for our buck.
Let me ask you to interact a little bit with each other. There are at least two subjects I'll float. One is the Commissioner, you were talking about funding, and I'm curious as to the reaction. I'm going to say two things. I'm curious as to the reactions of the fellows who are running fleets to doing things like raising fuel taxes. Sometimes the American Trucking Association has said, we're willing to pay more fuel taxes so that we can put more money into the infrastructure. I'm kind of curious about that. A second thing you might want to talk about would be the interaction with the rail system. Not only how you get, if you're using rail at all or have to go in and out of their facilities, but more substantially, you're crossing roads all the time with rail track going over them and trains going by. Are there any issues for you folks in that? So there's some grist for the mill.
And on the funding issue, I may not have a lot to say in the next couple of questions because this is going to cover it, but I think the infrastructure is the most important issue that we face. And it was kind of interesting to see during the recent round of federal stimulus how comparatively little money went to the highway system. And I just keep thinking that we all forgotten about the bridge collapse in Minnesota, and what's going to make us think that we're not vulnerable in other parts of the country. So, I know we're in an environment where nobody wants to talk about taxes, and all taxes are bad, and I agree because businesses are pinched, but at some point the decision has to be made. If we don't pay for this, we will leave the roads to the next generation in worse shape than we inherited them. And I don't think that's right. And so if there has to be a tax, whether it's a fuel tax or another kind of tax, so be it. But the system needs to be updated and upgraded, especially as population patterns shift. So just in response to the funding, I know that speaking individually, but also speaking on behalf of the TMTA, there's a willingness to engage on what it takes to make the roads right for the long term in kind of a safe and practical manner.
Really the same thing. When you talk about the taxes, whether the trucking companies bear the brunt of that, that's all fine and dandy. We can get ahead and do that. But when that happens, you and I are all paying for it. There's nothing that goes down that road that you use or consume that hasn't been moved by a truck. So now that fuel is approaching $4 and $5 a gallon, and the amount of tax money that's involved in that increase, that's fine. It's what we're paying for. The fact of the matter is, just like he just said, that the infrastructure is what's suffering. The major expansion that's necessary to meet the growth that we're seeing is just simply not there. The wait times, the traffic, the lack of utilization, the waste of everything is just growing and growing. So as far as taxes go, we need to do whatever it takes because it's just not getting any better. And if we just sit around thinking that it will, it's not. It's just heading in the wrong direction right now. So raise the taxes or do whatever has to happen, but the infrastructure has to be taken care of.
You want us to comment on rail too?
Well, whatever. Let Nancy speak up. She has something.
I was just going to mention, as long as we're touching on the funding side, it isn't just, I guess, more money. I mean, money is always good, but it's also the way that we raise money for our freight infrastructure. One of the challenges that the railroad side has is, of course, historically, and continues to be, the railroad's a privately owned asset as opposed to the roads, which are publicly owned. So historically, there's not been public sector monies that have been put into improving the rail system, even if that could benefit the community through reduced congestion, reduced emissions, as well as improving the economic situation if it provides better options for the consumers. So we also have to think about how we want to structure that taxing authority and the distribution of monies in the long run. Examples are some of the projects we've looked at that have significant benefit on the railroad side. Just make up some numbers, we might have a $10 million project that would alleviate a bottleneck on the rail system. And the calculations are that it gives $7 million worth of benefits to the private sector, which in this case is the railroads, and let's say $7 million worth of benefits to the public sector through reduced congestion, reduced railroad crossings. You know, let's just say it was a great separation. But that project doesn't happen because it doesn't have enough private benefits for the railroad to decide that they can independently invest. The public sector says it doesn't have enough public sector benefits to make it independently investable, and we don't really have a mechanism where you can combine those two funding partners. We've got to have a way to be able to have public-private sector involvement in order to make a lot of the improvements on the rail side happen.
Let's use this as a segue into our next question, because the next question is really, what other impediments are there to improve logistics and freight performance? And the point that I'll make to set this up a little bit is we pay for performance one way or another. We're going to pay one way or another. Everything that we use and touch somehow gets moved around. None of the things in your house came from next door. Somehow they got there, right? So if performance is lousy, we pay for it because you're going to have more trucks. Your customers can't get the job done. They have to build up bigger inventories or they're going to move out. We pay for that. Or we pay out of our tax pockets or some other way in order to feed money into the system so it performs well, so the job gets done. Because this system has to do a good job just like any other system needs to. And Nancy, you were touching on a very useful question, which is that as the public and the private interests come together, there very much are places where we come together, but we don't have good methods for doing that. So pick up on that and run with it as you like.
Well, clearly, obviously, the biggest and most obvious is funding. So we've got to do, whether it's public-private partnerships or partnerships with other, as far as Precinct 2 is concerned, other governmental entities, we've got to do a better job of coming together to identify, as Nancy mentioned, identify some of these projects that have both public-private benefits and combining our sources and our willingness to work together. So that's clearly where we suffered in the past and not done a good job, and where we need to improve and do a better job in the future. And I won't steal Nancy's thunder because she knows more about it than anybody in the room probably, but there are a couple of significant areas within Precinct 2 where we could really put a public-private partnership together to do a couple of identified projects that would have tremendous impact and benefit not only on the congestion right here in our own backyard, but to getting the goods out and where they are ultimately going to be down the road. So I think that's the obvious answer, sure, but the biggest.
I'll pass it down to the guys here in a second. I want to add, as long as we're talking about impediments, obviously funding, we all are very focused on. A couple of those on the rail network I just want to add. One is the issue of kind of the loss of corridors. I was thinking about when we were talking about 146. We're all looking forward to some highway improvements on 146, but much of that space has been made available by the sale of a rail corridor to the highway department, which is great. I mean, the railroads agreed to sell it, the highway department needed it, and they made it happen. But that also means that's another corridor that we've lost in the future for some sort of dedicated freight movement. Same thing happened along I-10. Obviously, that's where all that space came from to do I-10. And there are pressures in other parts of the region to say, you don't really need that rail line, we need it badly for something else. And maybe we think we do right now, but does that limit our options in the future? The other place that conflict's coming into play right now is with commuter rail. There's a lot of interest in commuter rail. 290 is one place where Gulf Coast Rail District is looking at trying to promote a commuter rail project. But again, we're talking about a limited amount of capacity, whether it's the capacity on the track itself or just capacity is defined by the size of the corridor. And if it's used for commuter rail, obviously it's not used for freight transportation. That doesn't mean we can't do both, but the fact of the matter is it's an intense competition for very limited resources. In the rail network side, that limited resources is in essence a dedicated right-of-way that can be used for freight transportation. And we all need it for lots of things. And I think that's going to be one of the long-range challenges also.
the funding at the top of the list, it's already been spoken about. I think it's key, and I think you've heard from a lot of everybody on the panel is pretty much in agreement on our infrastructure concerns, and they're not going to come free, they're not going to come cheap. The other impediment, just from a process standpoint, I think is alignment, and the public-private initiatives, I think, have potential to make so much progress, just like the study that's being conducted right now. But we need more of it. We need more of it. You know, for example, I mean, if shippers need to be involved. The shippers, a lot of times, the economic decisions they make will force the behavior of trucking companies. You know, as I said in my opening remarks, I mean, trucking and rail industries need to be allies and partners in the project, not work against each other. Any mode of transportation, rail, trucking needs to work with the shippers. So I think that there needs to be a lot more alignment, a lot more agreement, and a lot more voice that's in common on these issues, because if they're not addressed, and if they're not addressed properly, we're all going to suffer, whether we're running a warehouse, whether we're a manufacturer, whether we're a trucking company. So the more public-private that can be geared around alignment, so there's less, argument back and forth. And I'll just provide one example. There's, most everything that Chris has said, I would agree with. But one thing that he said that has raised a kind of a concern for me personally and for the TMTA, and it's the kind of stuff that needs to have a lot more discussion around it, is this idea of running heavier trucks on infrastructure that can't support it. The American Trucking Association has, in certain cases, endorsed this concept, running open highways for, running certain parts of the country, but talking about here in our own communities. Take my word on the chassis pool that I described and some of the issues in the chassis pool. Now you want to put another, 15, 20,000 pounds on those chassis in a heavily congested area on roadways that we all agree need improvement. Now, does that mean that the idea of heavier loads is bad in and of itself? No. And I agree that braking technology is a lot better than it was. But what it does mean is there's a lot more discussion that has to go on. And the last effort, the effort that's ongoing or was ongoing to increase in this corridor, the weight, the last I heard was 98,000 pounds, didn't involve the TMTA whatsoever. They weren't included in the discussions. And so that's a good example where, is it something that should be said no to forever? No. Should it be discussed? Yeah, but are there some concerns? Will it really reduce trucks? Can the infrastructure support it? Will the chassis and the pool support it? Our drivers who spent their whole careers hauling 80,000 pounds going to be just fine training-wise when they haul 98,000 pounds. Braking speeds, everything changes. It's that kind of complexity and that kind of dialogue that has to happen for meaningful progress to be made. And that still centers around inclusion and alignment and a real open discussion. Because really, at the end of the day, if we get it wrong, everybody's safety in this room is affected.
Thank you. I agree with some of what Ryan says. Mainly in that he talked a lot about alignment. I think it's critical that more meetings like this take place, where you have the private enterprises and the public come together to talk about the issues, because they all affect us. It is such things as working together and understanding load and delivery times, and how flexible can we be with just getting trucks in and out of a place 2 hours earlier and getting in and out before rush hour and things like that. Those are simple things I think that can be looked at, working within the community and things like that. And as a public, getting educated, understanding what's going on. Even when you talk about weight regulations and things like that, and the pavement and the structure, you can add extra axles and actually displace the weight over more tires, which would actually be better for the road system as it is right now. So there's a lot of different things, and that also, when you add axles, you add brakes and everything like that. So There's certain ways of doing that. There can be some regulation around it, but it's about being educated. It's about understanding how, if the government does change the hours of service, how does that truly affect the way commodities are going to be moved across the United States? What's the true impact of that going to be? Is it going to improve safety? Are the hours of service the way they are they okay? Are they good enough where they're at? Has safety been improved over the years? Or is a drastic change really necessary? And if so, what's the data that backs that up? And I don't think any of us really understand that completely unless we have interaction like this where everybody comes together and talks about it.
Let me, you don't need to.
No, I'm good.
Then I'll let, we'll turn to the last question, which also flows out of this discussion, which is we were talking a little bit about the effects of the potential changes on the on truck movement and what that may do to the community. And this is the last question is about: are there sustainability initiatives or mitigation initiatives that would improve the impact of freight on the overall community? Now, sustainability here can be things like air quality or greenhouse gas emissions, but there can be other things as well. Energy use is an important question, and the mitigation has to do with what it's like to live with freight. And all of you live in the community, so all of you, I'm sure, have had days when you wondered, why is such and such a truck going down this particular street where I live? And maybe there's a good reason for it, but you wonder. Sometimes that thought has crossed your mind. Or you've had days when you've been driving down a road and you're waiting behind something that had to happen first, and you feel a little bit of frustration, even if you know there's a good reason for it. So this is where you put yourself back in the neighborhood, driving in your own car, and say, what are the things that can be done to reduce impact? Who wants to start? Go ahead.
I can do it because I'll be short and sweet. I think as far as the county is concerned, we have to have increased utilization of rail. That it won't, even if it was fully utilized, it wouldn't put the trucking industry out of business, not by a long shot. We've got plenty of capacity, plenty of goods to move around the area without threatening anyone's livelihoods. But if we can better utilize rail and whether it's just an at-grade crossing and changing, I don't know how many at-grade crossings we have in the area, 1,200 at-grade crossings. I mean, if we can hit the half dozen biggest ones, that would make a huge impact, that would make a huge difference. Not to mention if we could, and I know Judge Emmett, this is something near and dear to his heart, but if we could better utilize the rail system and have a meeting point somewhere out in north of town or west of town where everybody collects, congregates to then ship their goods out to parts in the northwest or wherever they're going. So I think a better utilization of our rail system that would certainly have an impact in taking some of our freight off the streets, but even if it's just reducing the traffic impact of freight, it would go a long ways. Certainly something we should be taking a hard look at, and that's what we're here talking about, obviously.
Adding to what the commissioner said, you think of the sustainability and neighborhood environmental impacts of rail there's two sides of it. Rail can be a very efficient way of carrying goods. Again, it's not really there are places it's in direct competition with the trucks, but not exactly. Generally you think of rail as being longer haul. You don't put things on a train to go across the region. You put put goods on train to go across the country. But you needed to be operating efficiently in order to do that. But if you do that, you can take trucks off the road, you can save diesel fuel, you can do a lot of things that can benefit the environment. But the flip side is those trains have to go through somebody's neighborhood to get there. As we've said, since so much of the origin of the goods is in East Harris County, they can't magically transport themselves to the other side of the region to get out of town without affecting somebody. Some of the things that we're looking at as the district are things like trying to get additional grade separations done, One of the studies we're working on right now, for example, is what's called a closed corridor. And we're looking at one of the corridors in East Houston to where there would be a long section where there would be no at-grade crossing. So there would either be overpasses or there would be road closures and smaller roadways. But what that allows it to happen is it keeps the trains from having to idle in the neighborhoods, which can benefit the neighborhoods. It benefits the railroad because the trains can get through at a higher speed than they can if they have to cross roadway after roadway after roadway, which happens. But it isn't without impact on the neighborhood. If you start talking about street closures, you start talking about dividing areas that have been a single cohesive neighborhood for the last 120 years. Trains idling can make a lot of pollution, but trains going faster can make a lot of noise. So there's trade-offs in making this happen, but I think if we can look at the places that have the biggest potential benefit to the freight movement, I think it can be done in a way that has benefits to the surrounding communities as well.
I agree. I think that, educating shippers and educating the public generally about choosing the best mode of transport. I mean, there's times that the rail makes more sense than anything. There's times that barging does, trucks. I mean, there's a lot of options, and sometimes I wonder if there's as much education about the options and effective utilization. But in terms of sustainability, finding the best mode and educating people on that, I think, makes a lot of sense. But for a local move, the odds are just on a regular local move somewhere in the city, that's going to be done by truck for the foreseeable future. And there, on sustainability, I really focus on air quality. And again, it comes to educating shippers. What's interesting is more and more shippers, more and more of our customers, are really kind of starting to ask questions about, what's the average age of the fleet? And what are your environmental sustainability commitments? I mean, in other words, what's your policy on truck idling? And I think the more people are educated, then they can make their decisions. Because you've all driven behind a real old truck and knows what that is emitting every day. Now multiply that by I don't know how many thousand. So, people can vote with their dollars. If I want the absolute cheapest, lowest rate, and I don't care what you send as long as it's got an engine and some wheels, all right, that's what you'll get. But if people vote for a more sustainable future, shippers and buyers of freight will drive change faster than any regulation and any policy ever could. So it has to do, I think, a lot with education. And then, I think Chris had mentioned, something we would love to ideally see is more and more off hours. The more that we can do that's away from the traffic patterns, the better. But also, there's more people than just the truckers that have to change their behaviors to do that. Chris was absolutely right when he said drivers would love to work that third shift. And, it would be great for asset utilization. It's a great business proposition. But, again, it doesn't really do any good if there's nowhere to deliver. So that would take, I think, a lot of pressure off of our local roads.
It's getting tough going last. Again, I agree with everything that's been said here. And the key moving forward is what was just mentioned by Brian. It truly is asset utilization. These are our assets. It's people, it's equipment, it's the infrastructure that's out there. I think the quickest benefit from all that is how we go ahead and utilize the assets that we currently have. Obviously, investment needs to be made into improving it and making it better. And mode of transportation, it is what it is. As it is right now, there's already freight sitting at the docks that just can't be delivered. We are already, with the economy being what it is, at a point where I have a difficult time hiring truck drivers. Nobody wants to drive a truck. So I'm not really worried about truck freight disappearing. It's not going anywhere. If we put more of it on rail, that's fine. But I'm already at a point where it's difficult to increase the capacity that I have right now. So that's just absolutely not the issue. I think that the true way to make this whole thing sustainable, is figuring out how we get the private industry and the public working together to utilize the assets that we have currently.
There's one point I'd like Chris to bring up a little bit on the on these issues as well, because you mentioned earlier that your company handles a lot of hazardous materials, and your company expects and your customers expect a substantial amount of effort into handling that with care. And since you brought the subject up before, I didn't want to leave it without you saying something further about how that's done.
Yeah, as far as the safety side of it goes, that's our highest priority. We focus on turnover. Turnover in the trucking industry is typically pretty high. It's upwards of around 100%. My particular facility right here is at 25%. We try to hire people and keep people. We want to be customer-centric focused, but we want to make sure that we're focusing on individuals that come into our facility. We use a business fit strategy with every individual that comes into the organization. We have a significant amount of training that takes place. Our organization is RCMS certified, so we have a third-party vendor come in and look at the way we do things to make sure that we're responsible care partners, and that's a big thing in this area. We all have TWIC cards, we all have to have hazardous material endorsements, so there's a lot of background investigation going on. But truly what it boils down to is having the right people doing the right thing, making sure they fit into our organization. And we spend a great deal of time and effort making sure that that's what happens.
Now, we have some questions that have come in from the floor, and we have more of them than we have time for, so I'm going to pick out a few. First of these runs off of Chris's point on increasing truck capacity limits, but it turns it around to the port. It says, Houston, which is the second largest port in the nation, at least by tonnage, is the only port region in the country, or so the questioner says, that doesn't include an overweight corridor. In other words, a corridor for particularly heavy cargo. What can we do as a region to catch up with the rest of the nation's ports? And part of the context for this, too, is that Houston is also, because of the petrochemical industry, is a tremendous project cargo port, which means it has an unusual amount of large and heavy freight to handle. But the question is, we locally haven't done things that other ports have done. Is there a way to catch up? Anybody?
As far as the question goes, I mean, if you're talking about a single heavy piece, right, you can get that permitted, no problem. It's a matter of, with the cargo that's divisible, how heavy is heavy enough. And right now, you can get a permit in Texas. It's a permit, I think it's an annual permit that runs with your truck that lets you gross up to 84,000 pounds. So the real number is 84, not 80, if you buy the permit. There's some rules there. You can't run the interstate, but for state highways and local deliveries, it works just fine. So you can get legal at 84 right now with the appropriate permit. The issue is clearly other ports, other parts of the country have gone to higher weights and supported higher weights. The concern that the TMTA has, especially the local trucking companies that make up the TMTA's intermodal committee, just has to do with what's the process followed to be sure this thing can be done safely, with the condition of the chassis pool, the condition of the roads, what do the steamship lines have to say, and what's the port's position in all of this? Because we really haven't heard from the port saying it's what they want. So it's where kind of different, shippers, trucking industry, the port, law enforcement, DPS, everybody needs to have a place at the table for this dialogue to go forward. So the idea that it's not happening here, I don't think we should just go ahead and copy what other people have done. A lot of those ports don't necessarily have some of the infrastructure and local issues that we have, but it needs to happen with a much more robust and diverse participant group.
Yeah, just briefly, because it ties in nicely. There were certainly ideas out there that have been considered and for whatever reason have just not made it to the table, whether it's the proposed and planned Fairmont, excuse me, I just went blank. Fairmont Tollway, which would not necessarily be on Fairmont, but that was something that was considered several years ago and ultimately didn't see the light of day. But some ideas like that are worth, at least as far as I'm concerned, everything's worth revisiting. That's one of them that is. And it ties in nicely with the expansion of the Panama Canal because we've got a whole lot of planning to do to be able to accommodate the increase that we all expect we're going to see.
Yeah, we have changes on the horizon. The next question, and it's a different question. By the way, I want to, Brian has referred a few times to TMTA, and I think he described what it was at the beginning, but anybody who mightn't have caught it is the Texas Motor Transportation Association, is basically the trucking association for Texas. And he runs a company as well as being a member of that. So the next question is, what's preventing major goods or in container movement from running basically off-peak, moving from daytime to nighttime operations, which might then better use the capacity that we have? Now, that's the question. To the extent that the answer to that is, well, we do what our customers are asking, try to anticipate what it is that's causing the customers to do that as well.
Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, of course, we go long haul, so it's not all about picking up and delivering. It's about going down the road. But one of the issues that we run into is while you're going down the road, where are you going to stop to spend the night? Because you can only drive for so many hours, and you got to stop. So depending on when you did pick it up, your clock is running, so to speak. So you have to take advantage of that day from the time you picked it up. Now what you're starting to see is drivers are rushing to get to certain locations, truck stops and rest stops, because there's no other place to go. So people are trying to get there before nightfall, just so they have a place to go. So it's things are just shortening up. There's no place for everybody to be. The infrastructure is just not there. So they're not taking full advantage of their ability to drive in the night hours because they're afraid they're going to come up on someplace and they can't get in. And unfortunately, that's just a true reality from our side of it.
And then, I mean, I know you made the point about, well, not necessarily what the customer wants, but, a lot of customers, a lot of shippers and consignees and warehouses, I mean, they're only going to work a certain shift. I mean, they're not opening up that late shift just to accommodate the trucks if it's not profitable for them to do so. And then there's the issue of the port hours. I mean, the port doesn't necessarily work, any extended hours. Rail hours are different. I mean, some of the rail terminals.
The port is 24/7 operation. They are unloading and loading ships 24/7, and there are containers waiting there until they get put on trailers and hauled out. All you have to do is look at the traffic flow on 146 and 225, and it's dominated by daytime operations. And yet, I will challenge you, go out tonight when you leave, whatever way you go home, and check and see about the traffic that's on the roads and highways. There's a huge amount of underutilized capacity. See, now, 290 at night, you could boogie right out of here, and you wouldn't be in congestion. You wouldn't be causing congestion or contributing to it. But if you don't think about and tell your customers and clients that their shipping is going to go faster because it isn't going to be stuck in the urban area and your drivers are not going to be stuck in the urban area, you're never going to turn the situation around. There's too much infrastructure overhang. That is infrastructure that's out there that's going to cost us more and more to maintain and rehabilitate. If we don't utilize that capacity 24/7, the most efficient way possible, we're wasting that capacity. I'm sorry, that's a matter of dollars and cents and not convenience. There are warehouses here that could take in containers and break up containers. If they knew that those containers were going to leave the urban area or they were going to come in and get broken up quicker if they weren't stuck in traffic. I'm sorry, I'm hearing a lot of gee whiz and whatever, and I'm saying you're not going to get another dime for another roadway capacity if you don't use the capacity you got. There's a lot of people out there who are really pissed off about you asking, and anybody asking for more money for something that doesn't get used as efficiently as possible. So, you know, I'm sorry.
Let me comment on that, because maybe I didn't make that point clear enough, but the issue is that the ports only have certain hours they're going to load and unload trucks. Now, in the spirit of public-private dialogue that all of us have talked about, if there was a way for the ports to extend hours and load trucks later into the night, absolutely. I was commenting that one of the current barriers we've got today is that if your truck's not in by a certain time, it's not going to get unloaded, it's not going to get loaded at the port. What they do after those hours has no bearing today on whether or not your truck is going to get loaded. But one of the very practical discussion would be what would the impact be, cost-benefit-wise, of longer hours? Because sure, you could get loaded later into the night. It's happening right now with a lot of rail ramps. There's no reason it can't happen at the port facility. My only point is that as of today, it's not. Could it change? Of course. That's why we're all calling for a better public-private dialogue to have those very discussions. But today, you're not going to get loaded at Bayport or Barberside after 5, no matter what they're doing once those gates close.
You have much leverage with your customers? A little bit?
I think customers are changing. I mean, I don't think you can expect change overnight, but if 5 years ago we went and talked to customers about NOx, and the impact of truck pollution and new technology, I think their eyes would glaze over. Now they're asking. We're not going there. They're asking, saying, what's the average age of your fleet? And look, our customers live here too. So they travel the same roadways. We're all in this together. So, I don't want to use the word leverage, but could we have a discussion with our customers about any of these topics? Of course we could, and we should. I mean, these issues won't get solved with just the trucking and rail industry and the public sector. The shippers and businesses have to have a major seat at the table. So, I don't know if it's leverage, but it's certainly inviting them to the table because they're all part of it. And every time I've had this discussion with a customer about any of these issues, there's a real interest and a real willingness to engage because they know it's important to their long-term competitiveness too. This is an area where we are 90% in agreement. The disagreements are ones that get solved by dialogue.
We'll leave that there. Part of the response there is that we don't have everybody who should be here to fully answer that kind of question.
Anybody from the Port Authority here, maybe I won't recognize them even if they were standing in front of me, but if that's the issue, you need to be going down to the commissioners and saying, look, if we want to make, let me give you an example. There's $55 million worth of public money that's being spent on a flyover and Port Road. There's all the additional money that's being spent on 146, just so a handful of traffic lights can be dealt with. I can tell you that if the shippers were operating 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., every one of those traffic lights could have been reprogrammed so that there wouldn't have been an impediment to moving expeditiously along 146. And that $55 million that included the flyover probably wouldn't have been necessary either. But because we won't utilize the assets we have all the time and try to concentrate during the daylight time, we're competing for that same capacity. And you can see it on 146 and 225. You can see where jurisdictions, for example, want to restrict trucks to right-hand lanes only. Gee whiz, why do they want to do that? Because the voting clientele that they're responsible for mostly doesn't want to be dealing with trucks 4 lanes across. So I'm just saying that if we don't utilize our public and private assets more efficiently and fully, we're really talking, we're just making hot air. The pipelines operate 24/7, the railroads for the most part operate 24/7, the maritime folks for the most part operate 24/7, and I can assure you the economics of all those operations are dictated so that they do operate 24/7 and give their customers the best possible service and economics. If we don't do that with public assets, I'm sorry, with the infrastructure overhang, every piece of sewer, water, road, whatever public asset it is, costs more in the future just to maintain and replace than it did to originally put in place. And that money, nobody is looking at how that equation, how that calculus is going to work out, except to say, oh my God, we don't have the money. Look what the grief the city of Houston went through for dealing with stormwater management. Well, guess what? Every public infrastructure asset faces the same dilemma. And I'm sorry, but if we don't use them fully, especially when they're underutilized, it ain't going to sell with anybody, and you're going to end up with a crappy road.
Thank you. I need to move this along, but it's a question in front of all of us, and every fleet operates 24/7, but not everybody's customers do. We're going to switch gears. Nancy, there's a question to you about the status of commuter rail and how it interacts with freight rail.
It is actually related to the same discussion we're having because it's kind of a time of day issue as well. Obviously, commuter rail is something that needs to operate in the morning rush and in the evening rush. So backing up, status of commuter rail. Right now, there is, again, lots of expectations and no money to do projects, but we're looking at feasibility of commuter rail right now on 290 and on the State Highway 3 line to Galveston as being two lines were identified as having potential high commuter rail demand, as well as being, probably more importantly, ones that Union Pacific Railroad is interested in talking to the public sector about allowing commuter trains on in the future. The general idea there is to be temporal separation. So you would have hours of operation for the commuter trains in the morning and hours of operations for commuter trains in the afternoon, and you would not have freight trains out there at the same time. Obviously it's a safety issue and it's a requirement of the Federal Railroad, the FRA, Federal Railroad Administration. There's one way you can mix commuter trains and freight trains. So I would say that the status is that there's being feasibility work done. There's high feasibility on both. Union Pacific is interested in either selling, leasing, or partnering in some fashion on both those lines. The big problem is going to be when the studies are complete in a year or so is where do the public sector dollars come from? It brings us back to money. But there are issues there with timing also. On the 290 study, for example, there is one customer on one section of the 290 line that doesn't want to load trains at any time except between 8 and 5. And they don't want to talk about temporal separation. And it's interesting to me to see how, I guess you could think of as, obviously your business is important to them, but it's one business that has the potential for putting some pretty significant costs into making something like this happen if the railroad doesn't want to just say, well, never mind. And they're a private business, I can understand why they don't want to irritate their customer. They have some leverage, they don't have the maximum amount of leverage. So there's feasibility studies, there's no money. It's the basic.
All right, it's about time we close. I'm going to give you one final question. It's a good question to end on because it's sort of open-ended and interesting. And then we'll stop after this. And answer this as you see fit, are there any cities, U.S. or other parts of the world, that have been effective and even visionary in planning and modifying their freight transportation infrastructure for current or future needs that we might in Houston use as a model? Anything?
That's a very tough question, and I won't give you a good answer to it, but I'll at least try. I'll give something. There's a representative from Judge Emmett's office, and obviously in the county we're very lucky to have an elected official who is a transportation expert. Judge Emmett, in a talk I had with him last week, kept referencing, I believe it was Amsterdam and the port system they have over there and how efficiently they load from port to rail to get it out of the immediate area so that it can then be all contained in one other spot away from the sender and then effectively dispersed and have a limited impact on the immediate area but around their port area. So I don't have any good details for you, but that's at least one model that a transportation expert in the county has referenced and holds out as a model for for us to be looking at and considering.
That's good. It's Rotterdam, because that's where the port is, but but Netherlands is really small anyway, and they take their trade very seriously. They live and die on it. So it's a good example. Anybody else?
Well, without giving too many details, I would add, there's doing some interesting things in Chicago right now, in the sense of the headway they're making on public-private partnerships there, with looking at improvements on the freight side. They also run an enormous amount of commuter rail traffic over the same tracks and the same systems in a way that we have not managed to accomplish really anywhere in the South and the West. They're one of the first places that created something kind of like the Gulf Coast Rail District to try to bring the discussion of the freight side of rail into the public sector discussion. It's a start.
I can't speak with any personal knowledge about a specific example, but I would have, two points. I mean, I think a couple times now Panama was mentioned. When that canal widened, I think that a lot of cities are preparing for that. A lot of ports are preparing for that. Houston being one, but I think Savannah's done a good job. I think Savannah's looking very, very far forward right now, is using a lot of that, eastbound freight to be a real gateway. So I think we can look at what they're doing. But I want to take a step back for a minute and just remind ourselves what we're doing here. I mean, there's not a better place to do business in the country. That's just a personal opinion. But, I talk to trucking companies all over the country. I know how the recession and the economy hit them. Were we affected here? Absolutely. But to the same impact? No. I mean, and I think things like this, like the H-GAC, these dialogues are all just a step in the right direction. The good work the H-GAC does, the advocate that Judge Emmett is, I think, is significant. So I think we need to look at the business climate, the business community we're in, and just for a minute take a step back and know that we've got a long way to go, but also just remember that we've got a lot of things that are really special here and we should really be proud of. One thing is the friendly environment to business. You look at what's going on in the LA Long Beach ports, just the opposite. And there's a lot of shippers that can't wait for Panama to open for that reason, because they're going to be sailing to more business-friendly ports. So there's a lot of things we need to do better, but there's a lot of things we're doing well.
Again, I agree with all of that. I think we're faced with a good problem. We've got, you mentioned like Chicago, where they're starting to see a declining population. And more of that business and more of those people are coming this way. And again, when the Panama Canal opens up, we've got a lot of warehouses here, which people obviously had some foresight that there's going to be a lot of business coming to this area, so it's going to be a significant growth spurt. What you don't see here is the mass population using mass transit. We don't really have a commuter rail line. If you look at your major cities and just the ones I've lived in, New York City, Chicago, even Atlanta, where that gets used extensively. Unfortunately, we don't have that here, and I think that's something that has to be addressed. Everybody here is in love with their car. My travels through Europe and just the way that the community commutes back and forth is significantly different. I think we've got a different situation going here, and at some point in time, we've got to make a decision how we want to move forward with it. I absolutely applaud these types of opportunities to get out in front of people and talk to see what we can do to come up with a solution that's going to fit for our people here, because what we are doing is something that people want to be a part of. This is where the population is moving to, and we just need to address things as a group. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you all. Let me ask for a round of applause for this